More than 50,000 students are expected to walk out of classrooms across Germany in what is becoming one of the country's biggest youth protest movements in years. And at the center of this anger is one explosive fear: that Germany is preparing an entire generation for war. The movement, called Schulstreik, gegen Wehrpflicht, says the government's growing military buildup is slowly pushing young Germans toward becoming what protesters openly call cannon fodder. And the tension around this issue is rising fast. Schools have warned students they could face punishments or even expulsion for joining demonstrations during school hours. But despite the threats, organizers say the protests are only getting bigger. For many young Germans, this is no longer just a debate about defense spending or military policy. It feels personal. Because for the first time in decades, Germany's youth are being directly drawn into discussions about military service, compulsory testing, and possible future conscription. In a country with the historical memory of 2 world wars deeply embedded into society, that fear carries enormous emotional weight. And now, classrooms across Germany are becoming political battlegrounds over the future direction of the country itself. The roots of this crisis go back to the growing security fears spreading across Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Germany, long criticized for underinvesting in defense, suddenly found itself under pressure from NATO allies and European partners to rebuild its military capabilities. Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Defense Minister Boris Pistorius argue that Germany has no choice. They say Europe's security environment has fundamentally changed, and that Germany, as Europe's largest economy, must prepare for long-term instability and possible confrontation with Russia. That is why Berlin is now planning to spend nearly $779 billion on defense by the end of the decade, a massive increase that would push Germany well beyond NATO spending targets. The government presents this as necessary deterrence. Its message is simple: if Germany wants peace, it must prepare for war. But for many young people, those words sound deeply unsettling. Because when governments begin talking openly about military readiness, expanding armed forces, and preparing society for conflict, history suddenly stops feeling distant. The biggest trigger for the protests has been Germany's new Military Service Modernization Act. Under the law, mandatory questionnaires are now being sent to all 18-year-olds to assess their willingness and suitability for military service. Starting next year, compulsory medical tests will also begin. Technically, Germany has not yet fully reintroduced conscription, but critics believe the country is slowly moving in that direction step by step. One particularly controversial clause states that men aged between 17 and 45 could theoretically require military permission for extended stays abroad lasting more than 3 months. For protesters, this feels like the early architecture of a future draft system. Organizers argue that young people were never properly consulted before these measures were introduced. Many students say they already feel crushed under economic pressure, climate anxiety, housing shortages, and uncertain futures. And now, military obligations are being added on top of that. The result is a growing sense among parts of Germany's youth that politicians are making decisions about their future without listening to them. What makes these protests especially powerful is the symbolism behind them. The latest nationwide strike has been deliberately timed around the anniversary of the end of the World War II in Europe on May 8th, the day Nazi Germany surrendered. Protest leaders say this date serves as a warning about where militarization can lead if societies stop questioning it. That historical memory remains incredibly sensitive in Germany. Unlike many countries where military expansion is often celebrated openly, Germany carries the burden of its 20th century history very heavily. Protesters argue that large-scale rearmament risks reviving dangerous nationalist and militaristic thinking, even if today's political system is democratic. Some demonstrators have drawn direct connections between rising military spending and the influence of large corporations and defense manufacturers that stand to profit from rearmament. Across German cities, banners have carried slogans like "Education instead of army physicals," "The rich want war, the youth want a future," and "Dying is not on the timetable." These slogans are emotional, provocative, and designed to capture a deeper frustration, not just about military policy, but about priorities. Many students are asking why hundreds of billions can suddenly be found for tanks, weapons, and military infrastructure, while schools continue to struggle with shortages, poor facilities, and lack of teachers. The political divide over this issue is growing wider. Supporters of rearmament argue that Germany cannot afford to remain militarily weak in an increasingly dangerous world. They point to Russia's actions in Ukraine, rising global instability, and uncertainty surrounding the future reliability of the United States under leaders like Donald Trump. Many European governments now fear that Europe may eventually need to defend itself with less American support. In that environment, Germany's military expansion is seen by supporters as overdue and unavoidable. But opponents warn that military buildups can create their own momentum. The more countries prepare for war, the more rivals respond with their own military expansion, creating a cycle of escalating tension. Critics fear Europe could slowly slide into a new arms race mentality, similar to the Cold War, except this time with less political stability and more economic pressure. And for younger generations, the fear is simple. Once societies normalize militarization, it becomes easier for governments to justify future drafts, military interventions, and sacrifices demanded from ordinary citizens. That is why these protests resonate beyond Germany itself. Across Europe, many young people are beginning to question whether their future is being shaped more by geopolitical confrontation than by social progress. In the end, these student strikes are about far more than just military service forms or defense budgets. They represent a deeper generational clash over what kind of country Germany wants to become in the coming decades. On one side is a government convinced that military strength is necessary for survival in an unstable world. On the other side are young people who fear that preparing constantly for conflict may eventually make conflict more likely. Germany now finds itself trapped between historical trauma and modern geopolitical reality. The war in Ukraine, tensions with Russia, uncertainty inside NATO, and fears about Europe's future security are all pushing Berlin toward a larger military role. But every step in that direction also reopens painful historical memories that many Germans believed belonged to the past. And perhaps that is why these protests feel so emotionally charged. Because beneath the political arguments lies a much deeper fear that a generation raised believing Europe had finally escaped the shadow of war is now watching that shadow slowly return.